Could we have possibly? Ah, ha, ha, ho. I got good news. I have good news. Our dear brother Harpal. All right. Well, I chatted for a while, Harpal, but we've got time, and so happy to see you back. And what I was talking about, let me say this. What I was talking about was the importance of talking about the Indian Holocaust because of what's happening in Gaza, and that the Holocaust of Jewish people in Europe is used to justify some terrible acts. But I mentioned, I could go on and on and on about Holocaust after Holocaust. But let's talk about the UK British imperialism in India. If you could start off with, how it occurred. Sorry about that. The violence. The violence and theft. How it started, and give us some background on it.
Well, it's one of the most strange things, Garland, because India was initially conquered, although at some stage with the help of the British government, by a private company, the East India Company. It was formed initially in 1600 in the time of last years of Elizabeth I, but it's not until much later that it becomes a much more trading and powerful company. And they were trading in India, and for 150 years they traded. This was normal. The problem that they had about the trade with India was that they had to export bullion. And the age of mercantilism, that was a total disaster for any country that had to get rid of its bullion, because there was nothing that Britain had.
Doggone it, man. We're having a rough time here, but we're hoping we'll... Oh, there we go.
Oh, God.
Okay.
The only industry that was developed in Britain was the woolen industry. Now, if you know the climate of India, the woolen things will not sell very well. There are only a couple of months a year in northern India when it's really cold. But India was also able to produce woolen things. So it could sell nothing. So East India Company had to find a way of paying for the goods that it was importing. India was the world leader in textiles, both of the finest kind, which was used by very rich European ladies and Indian ladies to wear, and very cheap cloth, which went all over the world, including to the southern states of America, where slave labor was used. So India was a big exporter of cloth, and the East India Company wanted to import it. And how to pay for it? So the solution that they found was, eventually when they conquered India, we come to that in a minute, they took the cloth and sold it in the European markets. And with the money they had, they went to the New World, i.e. America, South America, etc., where they had been using slave labor to produce sugarcane. And sugar was manufactured. It was the commodity. It was at one time so important that one of the Caribbean islands, I'm just trying to remember its name, the Britain even thought of seriously swapping that with Canada, because Canada at the time was nothing. Its wealth had not been discovered, and it was a good idea if they could get hold of if they could swap, they could get hold of Canada in return for this island. It was at that time the jewel in the British crown, because it produced so much sugar. Barbados. So the sugar was, sorry? Barbados. And so the sugar was produced and was sold in the European markets as well as English markets. And with the money that they got, they basically were able to pay for the bullion and send the bullion in, like, that's how it was accumulated. So there were three sources really of British bullion those days. One was slave trade. It was called the triangular trade. You take the sugar from the New World, sell it in the European markets, and purchase slaves as well. And through the whole resultant transactions, you pay for the Indian cloth. And that was the solution that they found. But eventually, after 150 years of trading, the East India Company began to conquer territory. And it was able to conquer because Mughal Empire at that time was disintegrating, and local potentates were almost free from the central government of the Mughal emperor. So they stopped sending tribute to the central government, and they could make separate treaties. And the European powers were competing. This is the age where colonialism is rampant. They were competing to get hold of India, and the biggest rivals to Britain in India were the French. And the French backed one side of the local aristocracy, and the British another. The British side won with the help of course, British forces and troops. And they, within 5-6 years of helping them they said to the local ruler, who had become rather weak, you don't really know how to handle finances. We shall look after your revenues. And this is in Indian language called Diwani, i.e. the civil administration and the revenue administration. So they got hold of it. And 4 or 5 years after that, they said, you're not dispensing very good justice to your inhabitants, so we'll look after the criminal aspect of it. With that, they effectively became the rulers of Bengal, which at that time included Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. These are very vast areas. And as a result of nationalizing all land, the source of income at that time was the land revenue. And from the land revenue, they deducted expenses for running the administration, because they were running it for the benefit of Indians, everything in quotation marks. And then after all the expenses had been paid, and over a period of time, any expense that the East India Company incurred, whether it was waging wars against China, waging wars elsewhere, etc., everything was charged to the Indian treasury, which was really filled with revenue that they received from charging the peasantry for using land. And so this was the money. And out of that money, they purchased the cloth, which they sent and sold at a huge profit, because they were paying nothing for the cloth. So they were basically looting cloth, but it was hidden under the fact that this came from the Indian treasury, which was, of course, under their control. So that's the beginning of it. But their original methods of running India were literally loot, not exploitation in the capitalist sense of the word, where you have productive labor going and you are extracting surplus value. They were literally looting. As Marx pointed out, his articles were published, Garland, under the title, The First War of Indian Independence. These articles by him and his co-founder of scientific socialism, Friedrich Engels, are the best thing that you can find on the history of that particular period. Only a couple of 100 pages, you'd love reading it. And so what they did was Marx says, under the Mughals, there were 3 departments of state. One was the Department of the Interior, that's for internal repression and looting. One was the Department of Exterior, for waging war against foreigners and looting abroad. And the third most important item of expenditure, or the function of the Mughal government, was to look after public works, irrigation, etc., roads. And irrigation is very important in the Orient, because you cannot conduct any agriculture in the Orient without irrigation works. In Europe, it rains. So you have to have some drainage system rather than irrigation system. So the East India Company took over the first, i.e. appropriating the wealth of the Indian people through internal loot. And they, of course, also took over the function of waging wars against India's neighbors, etc. But they neglected the third one, which means within 30 years of the East India Company's rule, hell of a lot of area of Bengal had been turned into jungles. Population was declining, and it produced famines. And since we were talking about the famines, in the first 30 years of East India Company's rule, famines took the lives of 18 million people of Bengal. 18 million is a huge number of people. We will talk about the other famines that took place later on, but that was the basis of their loot. That's how they looted India. Apart from the money made by the East India Company, individual employees of the company came back with vast fortunes, including Robert Clive, who came to England. He came from a very modest background. He came to England with $500,000 worth of loot, £500,000 pounds of loot. So if you see the domains of his family even now in Wales, you would find how rich they became at the expense of India. So that was the initial phase. Then, of course, by the beginning of the 19th century, Industrial Revolution was in full swing in England. And the major industry at that time was the textile industry, which was built on the import of cotton from the southern states of the United States, produced by slave labor in those states. So they wanted a market for the cloth they were producing, and they could produce very cheap. So where would they go? They wanted to go to India. And of course, the Indian trade was the monopoly of the East India Company. So they fought long and big battles against the East India Company, and they were able to break its monopoly, and they were able to flood the Indian market with cloth. So the mercantilist period gives way to the bourgeois period, where the bourgeoisie in England is powerful enough to enforce its will and have the Indian market open to it, free trade. So that is the second phase. And then we come to it later on, but I just want to refer to it. From the second half of the 19th century, or rather towards the end of the 19th century, a new stage in the development of capitalism takes place. Free competition capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism. It becomes finance capital. It becomes imperialism. So the export of goods begins to be slowly but surely overtaken by the export of capital and setting up production in India, in plantations, in the railway system, in irrigation canals and all the rest. We come to the reason why that took place at that time later on, but I'll let you.
Let's do this. Let's separate out the famines. I brought out the one under Churchill that I've heard numbers of 8 to 12 million, but I know there were a number of famines. Let's go through the various famines and the numbers and how they happened. The major ones, at least.
As I've already mentioned, within the 30 years of East India Company's rule, Bengal suffered a famine in which 10 million people of the area perished. Then in the first half of the 19th century, there were 7 famines, and they claimed the lives of 1.5 million, which doesn't sound much compared with what happened in Bengal and what will happen in the second half of the 19th century. In the second half of the 19th century, there were 24 famines in India, and they claimed the lives of 28.5 million. Then, in the aftermath of the First World War, there was a flu epidemic all over the world. Now, you can attribute it to flu, you can attribute it to famine, but flu, of course, strikes those people who are very short of food, whose health is not very good, and it claimed the lives of 14 million in India. And then the Bengal famine that you refer to in the time of Churchill, it claimed the lives of 3.5 million Bengalis. just at a time when food was being exported from India to look after the British soldiers. Churchill refused to stop that, and Churchill refused to send food to the starving people in Bengal by saying it didn't matter, they were not important, and on top of that, Indians breed too much. This was another fallacy, that Eastern people breed too much. And Palmdath in his book, India Today, it's the best book you can get on modern India right up to the mid-1930s. He actually gives authoritative statistics and authoritative sources to say that the rate of increase of the population in India was lower than the rate of increase in the European countries. So this Malthusian theory, which was brought in England at the time, working class movement was getting very strong, and they were poor as well. He was saying they are only poor because they actually breed too many kids. Now that theory was debunked in England and the other European countries, and then it's traveled to the so-called third world. It traveled to India, it traveled to Asia, it traveled to Africa. Africa is, for example, one of the least populated continents in the world. It's not that the Africans breed too much. It's all a question of development. If there's a thwarted development and there are no other sources of revenue, and you're highly dependent on land, and land is cultivated on the most primitive methods, and you're ruled by foreigners who do not actually help to develop it, there's no manure, there's no fertilizer, there's no machinery, etc. It obviously is a very subsistence kind of agriculture which cannot support many people. And every time there is some kind of disaster, then a lot of people die and they claim. So really, if you calculate all of them, it's somewhere between 50 and 60 million people who died during the British rule in India for 190 years. So these are huge numbers of people. But capital is reckless. It's not that they didn't like the color of our skin. That might come to it later. It's the fact that it's about making profits. It's about extracting surplus value. They exhausted the soil of India. Through loot, they exhausted India, just as 9 generations of working people in England during the Industrial Revolution were consumed in the course of 1 generation. Children from the age of 5 were worked to death, working 16, 17 hours in dirty mills with a lot of dust, with a lot of heat, and they died. The average life of an English person during that time was about 30. So by the time you were 13, 14, you got married, you had 9, 10 children, most of whom died as children, and a few survived, and off you went to spheres celestial. So that's what capital does. That's the history of capital. So it's not just that they were actually treating foreigners badly. That's how they were treating the working people in their own countries. I was listening to your chat before we could be connected with each other. You know, you're quite right. The most important thing to ask about a society is, what is the relationship of the various sections of the population to the means of production? If the means of production are owned by a tiny minority and the others have to work for them, obviously the tiny minority lives by having the majority of the populations produce surplus value for them. That has been the case ever since the division of society into classes, from primitive communism to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism. It's only under socialism that racket is put an end to.
You know, the money. I recently heard a number, and you know, I don't know how it was adjusted for inflation, but $152 trillion that was stolen from India. It's difficult. You know, I've heard numbers like how much money, how many wages were stolen from slaves in America, and you know, I know it's people that it's difficult to calculate this. But your thoughts on the numbers, on, as I said, who got it? Because clearly in a feudal society, it only, you know, that kind of numbers went to the top of 1%, and the effect that had on the long-term development and growth of India.
In the beginning, obviously, it was the shareholders of the East India Company, and shareholders are rich people. It's not poor people who bought shares. You know, these days, even workers can buy a few shares in a company. But that was not the case then. It was the rich people who did that. And then, of course, eventually, once we'll come to that later on, there was a big national revolt. It's called the First War of Indian Independence in 1757. It very nearly threw the British out of India. After that, it was not possible to carry on ruling India in the same old style that the East India Company had done, basically looting and annoying every section of the population. That revolt had several reasons. It was not just, it started with the army. The Indian army was mostly composed of the Indians. There were a couple of 100,000 Indian soldiers, and the top positions were occupied by the British, which were about 40,000 at the maximum those days. So India was conquered not by the British, it was conquered by the Indians for the British, because they were able to use the divisions within society and were able to do that. So what happens is, after the revolt, the British government took over the East India Company. The East India Company was put an end to this. It just could not be allowed to carry on ruling India. So the Crown took over directly, and taking over, they realized that India could not continue to import British goods unless it could pay for them. And therefore, India had to be made productive. There had to be scientific exploitation, not the old type of banditry, rapine, and looting. So, and also, very soon after that, after the British government took over in 1858, but 5 years later, the American Civil War broke out. And the result of that was that the Union states were blockaded, the Confederates were blockaded by the Union Navy. So cotton could not come to England. And the most important industry at that time was the textile industry. So Britain had to find alternative sources of cotton. And India, among 2 or 3 other places like Uganda and Egypt, were used for developing cotton production. But of course, cotton not only had to be produced, but it had to be transported to England, which means it had to be taken from the interior to the ports of Bombay, etc. So they had to build railways, they had to build irrigation canals, they had to have transport system. And then, of course, once you start railways, as Marx pointed out, you have to have railway repair workshops. And in a country that is rich in iron and coal, you can't limit the production of machinery to just railways. It branches out to others. And that's how initially the industrialization of India, very with small and faltering steps, it starts then. Britain tried its best to prevent India from developing any industry. But one industry where the Indian capital got the upper hand was the textile industry, the very industry that Britain had destroyed, or the East India Company had destroyed about 100 years earlier. That industry was in the hands of the Indians. They produced a lot of textiles. But anyway, some industry began to be developed. As Marx said, no matter how vile Britain's motives and how stupid its methods of executing that policy, the British are the ones who caused the only real revolution in part of the world. Because Indian society had got stuck at a certain stage. They were oblivious to what was happening. There was a village society, there was a communal ownership of land. And it's, of course, much idealized by people who like to leave New York and go to a little rural place in America and grow their own potatoes. It doesn't work. It works for a few years and then they come back. But of course, it was something, it shook India out of its old lethargic style. I'm not saying Indian people were lazy and didn't work, but it was a style of life that imposed it on them. And so As Marx said, Britain had two historical functions to perform there. One was destructive, destroying the old society, and the other one was constructive, regenerating Indian society and laying the basis for a modern society. And he said England has successfully performed the first role, but the second one hasn't yet come. But it eventually would come, because they had laid the basis by building railways, by building canals, having a press, where views could be expressed. English education had been imparted to a certain small section of the population because they needed servants to work for them, and English language was very important. And the well-off families sent their kids to England to study. Some of them went to Oxford and Cambridge, some of them went to private schools like Harrow and Eton, and they came back imbued with the ideas of liberalism, of what life should be, why should they be servants. All these forces then combined, of course, to undermine British rule, if you like. But the real industrialization of India really does not start until after the British have been forced to leave. And even then, both the Americans and the British did their best to prevent India from developing a steel industry. Had it not been for the Soviet help, there would have been very little industrial development at that time. And India, of course, is no patch on China at the moment, but Indian industry is fairly well developed, and there's a large proletarian population, if you like.
Let me ask you this. He brought something, the Soviet Union. I have heard that there's a long history of very good relations between, the Soviet Union, Russia, etc., and India. Is that so? What's the history of the relations between those two, very old societies, civilizations? That why would somebody today say they have a strong relationship or a strong history? What is the history on their relationships?
But the real reason is, Garland, that the October Revolution was a revolution of a completely different kind. All previous revolutions had replaced one ruling class by another and one form of exploitation another. It was the first revolution that put an end to all exploitation. And having come to power, the Soviet Union actually published all the secret treaties that the imperialist powers had entered into during and prior to the First World War for division. They were telling their populations, we're fighting for the liberty of Belgium, whose neutrality has been violated by Germans and whatnot. In fact, they were fighting for the redivision of the world between the leading imperialist powers, but principally France and Britain. A bit comes to the United States as well, but the United States becomes increasingly more important after the First World War. They participated in the First World War only for the last 90 days of that war, no more than that. But they came out of it with a lot of productive capacity, and they were able to loan money to the other fighting powers, and so they were a creditor nation, and they were thus able to subdue all of them in the course of time. So the Bolsheviks had a program of national self-determination, which did not apply just to European nations like Hungary, Ireland, etc. The vast majority of the subjugated peoples were in the continents of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And they fought for the right of those colonized people, subjugated people, to fight for their self-determination. And they gave every possible support. And that's why they were so popular. And that's why they were so much hated by the ruling classes of Britain, America, and France. So they were, obviously the Indians very much admired the Soviet Union because it was standing for their right to free themselves from British colonialism. And when, of course, Indians achieved independence, they wanted very much to follow some of the things that the Soviet Union was doing in the field of industrial development, and they needed a lot of help. When that help was denied by Britain, Germany, and America, that help was given to them by the Soviet Union. And that really lays the basis of a solid relationship between these two countries, which has continued even after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, between Russia and China. Even today, notwithstanding all the efforts made by America and Britain and France, India buys half of our arms for its armed forces from Russia. It has strong trading relations with Russia. And you know that during the latest episode, and that you're well aware of, when America and Britain and France and all these countries have been imposing an embargo, an economic embargo on Russia after the so-called Russian aggression in Ukraine. India has withstood the pressure and continues to buy oil from Russia. And it buys oil because it needs oil. And secondly, it's able to get oil at a discount. And then it uses that oil to convert into various other oil-based products, which it sells to European countries. So the European countries are actually breaking their own sanctions in this case. And now they're all part of the BRICS, because everyone, even the Indians who are inclined to come closer to America, know that they cannot go far too much along that line, and they've joined the BRICS. And BRICS has become a very important sector there. All kinds of countries, semi-feudal like Saudi Arabia, there are capitalist countries, and there is countries like China in it. So BRICS today has more GDP than G7. It's become a very, very important bloc indeed. And that's really the basis of their continued cooperation. India's trade with Russia is increasing year by year. And even though there's friction between India and China, India's trade last year, two-way trade, was more than $200 billion. It may not sound much, but it's a lot of trade, if you like. And there are very few other countries whose trade runs to that much with China. One of them, I think, would be probably Venezuela, and of course, America has a very large trade with China, and the European Union.
Okay. Let me ask you this, just to touch back on the issue of Holocaust, and I think it's important. You've been following the Gaza conflict, you've been following the ICJ ruling, and of course the Zionists, utilize, I always say they utilize Judaism and Jewish people as human shields so that they can perpetrate their political ideology. But your thoughts on, we could talk about Holocaust, and we don't have enough time in the day to talk about what's happened in South America, what's happening with indigenous people, and what's happened in Africa, Middle East, on and on and on. In India, 50 to 60 million people, literally 10 times the German Holocaust. Why do you think it is that the German Holocaust against the Jewish people is so much more pronounced in the Western world, so put forward so much more in the Western world, utilized as an excuse or a reason for such violent activity, and all of these other brutal Holocausts of, many exponentially larger Holocausts? Not to compare one to the other, but this discussion for the purpose of one is put forward as though it were the only one, and all of these others are ignored. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, really, if you want to be able to look at their policy, you have to ask the question of what benefits them. And the whole thing is motivated by their ability to exploit various areas and to forget their own Holocaust. I mean, even if you leave the Jewish Holocaust by German imperialism, the system of exploitation of man by man and one nation by another actually is productive of Holocaust. And I was listening to you when we were not connected. You're quite right. There have been dozens of Holocausts in your own country before anybody else could be accused of Holocaust, the Native American population has been wiped out. Nobody knows how many, but there are probably 20, 30 million Native Americans who were wiped out. Australians did the same with the Native Americans. So did the New Zealanders, and 20 million, roughly, or maybe even 30 million Africans were forcibly transported to the new world by the slave trading European nations, and 12 million died on the way in what was called the Middle Passage. And then a suggestion was made when there was a Jewish the Holocaust in memory of the Jewish people done to death by Nazis. Somebody suggested, oh, can we add a section in the museum to the American slaves? And the Zionists were up in arms. How can you compare that to our special experience? No, there's no special experience. We should not be competing stupidly with each other. We had more killed than yours. The thing is, imperialism kills everyone it can find. And the German imperialist ruling class hasn't changed much. First, it perpetrated Holocaust against the Jews during the Second World War and in the years preceding the Second World War. Then today, it is actually helping the Zionists as former victims to perpetrate a Holocaust against the Palestinian people. So their trade in perpetrating Holocaust hasn't changed at all. And they're doing it all with liberal language, like they're trying to protect the poor old Jews. They couldn't give a damn for the Jews. All they're concerned with it is using the Jewish people for one purpose for which that state was formed, namely to be a representative of Western imperialism in what a former governor of Palestine said, British governor, in the midst of a sea of hostile Arabism. That is what it is. And the Arab countries, nature has put them in a position where they sit on overwhelming majority of the world's most important item for the last 100 years, namely oil. And they're literally floating on oil. And imperialism wants that. It wants to be able to control that. Their oil is not their oil. It's our oil, the imperialist countries say. The only thing about Trump was he was so honest. What are American troops there for? He said, we're keeping their oil. We are in northeast of Syria. We keep them there because we're protecting our oil. And that's all. All the others talk about human rights, rule of law, and international legality and rules-based international order and all the rest of it. But the real fact, and that's why they don't like Trump, because he actually lets their secrets out. Not that it's secret to you and me, but most people do not understand what the politics is all about. And that's why discussing war, Lenin said, the untutored average person does not understand what this war is about. All he says is, so-and-so has attacked my country, I must fight for my country, instead of saying, which is the class that is waging war on each side? What are they waging this war? If it's a war of national liberation, of course we will defend our country. If on the other hand, it's an imperialist war for the division of colonies, for the division of loot, then we do not. So that's why Jews have come in very handy. Having actually discriminated against Jews for over 1,000 years, the capitalist countries of Europe are now coming on as big protectors of the Jews. They're not protectors of the Jews. And the Jews, sadly, who were the most progressive people in the world, and they were in the van of every democratic and socialist movement in Europe, have been now mobilized to act literally, in the case of Palestine, like Nazis. And some of the Jewish populations in America and Western Europe have been mobilized to support that kind of genocidal activity. But luckily, I'm happy to say, there are a lot of young Jews who are coming who don't support that, and they say, not in our name. For example, in your own country, there's an organization called Jewish Voices of Peace, and they are demonstrated in thousands in front of the Central Railway Station in New York and closed it for a few hours. And this narrative is not going very well because most people are able to understand their history. What about the Chinese Holocaust by the Japanese? They, as you pointed out in your conversation before we were connected, they, within literally few weeks, they killed over 3 million Chinese in Nanjing. And their slogan was, destroy, kill, and loot everything you see. That's what they did. Now the Japanese are presented as peace-loving Buddhas, and China is supposed to be threatening them. China is not threatening anybody. And these are stories made because China has suddenly, from being a source of profit, which it was for 30, 40 years, when Americans exported a lot of capital there, made a lot of money, and without increasing the wages of the American working people, which have been stagnating for nearly 3 decades, they were able to keep their standard of living on the basis of cheap Chinese imports. So they made a lot of money from that and were able to stabilize their populations and prevent them from becoming very discontented with the system. So always look for who is profiting from what. That is what capitalist relations, international relations are about. They have nothing to do with actually preserving peace and order. They have nothing to do with the rule of law. In fact, war is business like any other ordinary business. And while workers pay for these wars, even in imperialist countries, with their blood and taxes and treasure, it's the few ruling class people who make money. Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. These people are opening, champagne bottles. As soon as the war starts, that's wonderful for them. It's like private medicines. The doctors in Britain used to rub their hands. Oh, cholera is gone. Now plague is coming. Wonderful, wonderful. We can make money. And that's how imperialists treat the whole thing. I hope sooner or later the Jewish people come out of that malady to which they have been subjected for nearly 75 years now.
Let me ask you this. Your thoughts on, I know you're familiar with the resistance movements in India and how they were able to overcome British imperialism. How about a comparison in your thoughts on, the axis of resistance, as they call it, the various private military unit, popular mobilization units, as they call them, PMUs, and the various resistance forces in asymmetric warfare used, including Yemen, the resistance in the Middle East against the U.S., what I call U.S. imperialism, British colonial, European colonialism, but clearly the U.S. empire is at the forefront of this and leading this now, prosecuting this genocide. Your thoughts on the resistance movements, the effectiveness of them, and maybe compare them to maybe either Vietnamese or Indian or other resistance movements that have been effective against large imperialist occupations and aggressions.
As far as the Indian movement is concerned, it's gone through several phases. The most important rebellion of the 19th century, before Taiping Rebellion, which took place in China in the 1860s, was the Indian Revolt in 1850-57. Which involved 30 million people, which covered about a third of the Indian territories. It was at that time the largest possible resistance. It didn't employ guerrilla warfare. It was actually headed by the army. The British had created, as Marx said, a center of resistance to their rule in the form of the British Army. They needed the army, but the army became the center of revolution, the resistance against the British, and were able to galvanize all the discontented people in India, whether they were in the rich ruling states, which were being absorbed by the East India Company one after the other, for going from one excuse to another. And when the Indian states, India had a funny system. There was British India, and then there was called Princely India. There were 560 princely states which ruled in their own little kingdom, but they really did not have the power because every single state had a British resident in it. The foreign policy and the defense policy of these states was in the hands of the British. So when these British and the Indian states realized that the East India Company was up to no good. They will take over their estates for making one excuse or the other. They all joined the revolt of the army. The peasantry who were impoverished and famished joined the revolt. Artisans who were losing their jobs because of the competition from Lancashire, they joined. The handful of intelligentsia existing at that time, realizing what was going on, they joined the revolt. So a lot of people joined that revolt. That was the first phase. After it had been suppressed by 1859, then began a different period. The British ruling class mended their ways. As I have pointed out before, from straightforward loot, they went on to develop certain means of producing wealth. But by the beginning of the 20th century, a new wave, anti-imperialist wave starts. Now that is divided into two sections. One was led by the Congress Party, which eventually was in charge when the Indian independence came. There was a policy, it had a policy of wanting to free India, but in such a way that the freedom from the British would not produce any socialist government that would threaten property relations of the Indian ruling sections, i.e. the landowning sections and the industrialists. Then there was a revolutionary section led by revolutionaries who wanted to free India with armed resistance. The British were able to isolate them, and partly with the hand of the Congress leadership. But as far as Vietnam is concerned, or Korea is concerned, it's in a completely different category. These were people mostly led by the communist parties and a very advanced ideology, and they fought guerrilla warfare. And in each case, they fought their opponents to a standstill. And what's happening in the Middle East is we don't have a communist leadership, but there are people who are fighting against foreign imperialism. But today, the ones who are really fighting are the people of Palestine and the people of Yemen. You know, they are much suppressed, but they are able to find ways of struggling. They've learned from previous struggles. For example, Gaza Strip is a very small territory, one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. They've dug tunnels, and the Israeli army is actually getting a beating. You don't get that impression from reading the mainstream news, but they're getting a beating. They're not winning. The Israeli army has gone with two publicly stated objectives. One, to destroy Hamas, and secondly, to free the hostages. As a matter of fact, the way they're going about it, clear they're not worried about the hostages. All they want to do is obliterate the Palestinian people, actually to ethnically cleanse Gaza to begin with, and later on West Bank and East Jerusalem from the Palestinians. The problem with them is the Palestinians outnumber the Jewish people of Jewish origin in those areas. So the only way the Israelis can suppress them is by killing every Palestinian. In the modern world, I think it would be impossible, next to impossible, to kill 7 million people. It could have been done in the early 19th century like the Americans did with Native Americans, but it cannot be done. So they are caught. They're not achieving any of their purposes. They say they want to destroy Hamas. What is Hamas? Translate, the acronym means Islamic Resistance Movement. It's no more fundamentalist than the Zionists in Israel. They fight in the name of, what are their parties called? Jewish Power and such like organizations. If you look at them, the way they dress, I mean, they look even more medieval than the Muslims in that area. So they are trying to win, but they cannot do it. Hamas is not the only resistance organization in that area. There are about 10, 12 different organizations. Two of them I can think of is the Palestine, the PFP, PLP, Palestine Front for the Liberation, and People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Then there is the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So there are secular movements as well as non-secular movements. But even the non-secular movement have a very revolutionary content to their activity. They're not fighting against Jews. They're not trying to kill Jews. They're fighting to free their country from the fascistic rule of the Zionists. And there's a disconnect between that resistance movement and the Arab masses on the one hand and the Arab rulers on the other. Apart from Syria, the Arab rulers don't give a damn about Palestine. And they thought they'd solved the problem. They were all coming to agreement with Israel with the help of US imperialism, the so-called Abraham Accords. And what the Palestinian resistance did on 7th of October last year was blew a complete hole in that strategy. They have put the question of Palestine right in the center, left and right, up front. Nobody can ignore it. It's not only the major issue in Palestine, in the Middle East now, but in geopolitics, it's one of the two issues, apart from Ukraine, which is actually consuming the energies of ordinary people as well as the ruling circles in different countries. So they have done a wonderful service. They've given notice. You cannot continue to suppress us forever, because as long as you are there, there will always be rebellion. There will always be resistance. I don't think the ruling circles in Israel are intelligent enough to understand that. But anybody who's advising them has got to actually tell them that. And the only people they'll listen to are the Americans. I don't believe in the theory that is the tail wagging the dog, that the Israelis control the American government. No, the American government controls the Israeli government. Of course, they let it be taken as though it's that the Israelis are doing and poor old Biden cannot do anything. As Max Blumenthal said during one of his interviews, he told his interviewer, I think it was Judging Freedom, Judge Napolitano, he said, Judge, before we finish this interview, this war could end. If Biden would pick up the phone and tell Netanyahu there are going to be no spare parts for F-15 and F-16 jets, there is going to be no aid, there's going to be no economic aid, there are not going to be military aircraft full of munitions landing every day in Israel and providing that support. Without American support, Israel could not last more than a few months. So really the war is not between the Palestinian people and the Zionist state. It's basically a war between imperialism and the Palestinian people, and by extension, larger Middle Eastern people. Just as in Ukraine, the war is not between Ukraine and Russia. It's a war between NATO on the one hand and the Russian Federation on the other. They're trying to have a regime change, the NATO countries, in Russia. And of course, they're trying to dismember Russia into easily digestible portions. And that's what these wars are about. The so-called left in the imperialist countries does not understand that. The best it comes is they're both imperialists. They're fighting for the division of loot. No, they're not. And they tell you we have no side to choose. My party's position, the CPGB-ML's position is we have a side to choose. And the side to choose in Ukraine is Russia as against NATO. And in the Arab world, choosing the resistance against imperialist-supported Zionist aggression against them.
Thank you very much, Harpal. I'm not hearing you, so we might have lost your sound for a second. But let me see. Well, at any rate, don't worry about it, because I'm just about out of time anyway. So we're going to be ending this. So, but thank you very much. We lost your sound. Oh, there you go. I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, I'm just about out of time anyway. I really appreciate it. We learned a lot. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah. Okay, Garland, whenever.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll be back in touch, and we got a lot more to talk about. I really enjoy learning about India, learning about the history of India, and of course, you know, having our anti-imperialist discussion. While people, before you leave, which one of your books, which one of the things that you authored would you recommend if someone's going to start with a Harpal Brar book club? What should they start with?
Well, really, I first of all, one book you don't have to advertise. It says advertise itself by the action of the authorities against our party, you know, Zionism and anti-Semitic, racist, and tool of imperialism. That's a small pamphlet. But among the books that I'd like people to have a look at is the book that I wrote on imperialism years ago, Imperialism, Decadent, Moribund, and Parasitic Capitalism. And then I wrote a book on the demise of the Soviet Union, Perestroika, the complete collapse of revisionism. And thirdly, my book on China, Socialism, the Chinese Characteristics. And I want to send you a book. I'm going to post it to you. I wrote a book on Zimbabwe. You may not know that.
No, I didn't.
And you've seen it, have you?
I've seen it, but I haven't had a chance to, you know.
No,
but I know a lot about it.
I'm going to ask our dispatch department to send it to you. I don't like to send you too many because they'll just get ignored if there are too many of them. So I send one at a time.
Yeah, you know, I do want to talk about, so maybe next time I would like to find out more about the Soviet Union, and in particular, the demise of the Soviet Union. So your Perestroika book sounds like something that we need to discuss that. We definitely need to talk about it, because people say things like, well, it was communism and it just fell apart. It just disintegrated because that's what communism does, or, you know, one thing or another. They don't take into account when it comes to the Soviet Union, the effect of the constant attacks on the Soviet Union by the imperialist countries. So I definitely want to do a segment maybe next where we talk about the demise of the Soviet Union.
I have a slightly different take from what most people do. Soviet Union fell not because of imperialist attacks. Of course, they were always there from the time of the October Revolution in 1917. It is because the revisionists in the Soviet Union did things which undermined the Soviet Union. If Soviet Union could not be defeated by imperialism during the Second World War, it was strong enough to resist all these attacks by imperialist countries. But what destroyed the Soviet Union was the policy that was followed from Khrushchev onwards. But we can discuss it whenever you have time.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you again soon. All right, everyone. As I always say, don't forget, everything's scrolling across the bottom where you can find me, and make sure if you are of a mind or ability to contribute, it's certainly appreciated. Make sure you share this on all your social media platforms, because as you know, I'm not on Twitter and stuff like that. So please share this. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Have a great day.